Go ahead and start that. Welcome. I know that folks are still filing in. We are at the top of the hour though, so want to go ahead and get started. I know we have quite the presentation ahead of us, so want to make sure that we give Deborah and her team as much time as possible. So I will, as quickly as I can, go through a couple of housekeeping bits. First of all, my name is Catherine Kemp. I'm the Senior Director of Veteran Services at the National Hospice and Palliative Care Organization. I am joined by my dear colleague, Em Marge, who many of you know and love. She is such a huge source of support for many We Honor Veterans partners. We're happy to have her here monitoring the chat box as well. I am very happy to be joined by a dear friend and colleague, Deborah Grassman. I know that many of you have heard her presentations. She has been a longtime colleague of us at NHPCO. She is not only a TED Talk presenter, but the author of 2 books that I know many of you are familiar with, Peace at Last, Stories of Hope and Healing for Veterans and Their Families, as well as The Hero Within, Redeeming the Destiny That We Were Born to Fulfill. She has been a contributing author to numerous textbooks, articles, featured all across the board. And during her 30-year career at the Department of Veterans Affairs, she personally took care of more than 10,000 dying veterans. So we are very thrilled to have her here. I will be turning the virtual microphone over to her in just one moment. As we go through today's webinar, please feel free to utilize the chat box. Comments, questions, anything that comes up, we are going to have some time for a short Q&A at the end of the webinar. But if you have anything that you really want to make sure that we address, please put it in the chat box, or the Q&A is open as well. A reminder that if you are needing continuing education credits for this webinar, please make sure that you as an individual are registered and logged in. We will be sharing the names of attendees with the folks at Opus so that they can make sure that you get those continuing education credits, but that is the only way to do so. So if you do have questions following the webinar about your CEs, please reach out to Angie at Opus and we'll be putting her M in the chat box. As usual, this webinar is being recorded. However, we will not be sharing the slides for today. So please settle in, enjoy the webinar, be present, and if there's something that you happen to miss, do not fear, because again, the webinar will be recorded and up on our website. You can watch it as many times as you would like, share it far and wide. Another quick reminder, there are a few other things coming down the pipeline over the next few weeks. We just wanted to make sure that you all are aware of. On February 8th, NHPCO will be hosting with the Department of Veterans Affairs a webinar titled Psychedelic Therapy for End-of-Life Distress, Potentials and Pitfalls. We will be entering the registration link in the chat box. And then also do not forget to miss the Anchoring Heart activities on February 2nd. There will be a webinar, a lot more information, and a moment for us to collectively take a few minutes to anchor our hearts together. So the information for that will be in the chat box as well, and it's on the event page. I think that covers everything. If there's any further questions, again, pop them in the chat box. But for now, just sit back and I am going to hand things over to Deborah.
Oh, goodness. Well, thank you so much, NHPCO, Catherine, Emily, all the things that you're doing to advance end-of-life care for our veterans. I can't thank you enough. And I thank all of you clinicians who are in the audience who provide that care and want to serve veterans in a meaningful way. And my hope is that the information that I give you today can enhance your practice. So I'm going to start with some basics that lay the foundation for delivering effective ceremonies, and whether those ceremonies are at a patient's bedside or if it's a community event. So really there are 2 fundamental things that are going to help with that. One is learning how to abide with veterans. In other words, open our hearts to vicariously feel what they are feeling. And secondly, learn how to provide veterans with self-help tools that they can use to help heal the relationship that they have with themselves. And I can tell you that that can be a bit tricky with veterans. So I'm rather embarrassed to tell you that for the first 10 years of my VA career, I harbored a prejudice against Vietnam vets. You know, when I would hear parts of their stories about their Vietnam experiences, I'd think scornfully to myself, you know, those are just excuses. The war's been over for years. They need to get over it and move on with their lives. And what's with the long hair and tattoos? What's that all about? Well, that all changed when our medical center did a display of artwork from veterans throughout the state of Florida. You know, I popped into the room where those paintings were, and I quickly surveying the hundreds of displays when suddenly I was stopped in my tracks when I saw this painting. Suddenly, I saw what that soldier saw. More importantly, I saw how that soldier reacted to what he saw. I saw the tears of blood, you see, the loss of vitality. And that's when my eyes were opened. More importantly, that's when my heart was opened. Now, I tell you this story because for us to care for others, we have to be aware of our own prejudices. And we all have prejudices, don't we? In fact, if we think we don't have any, that's the real problem, isn't it? Because we all have a human brain that acts as a filter. And it's about bringing that filter out of the dark into the light so we can see how it is impacting our relationships. And to do that, we have to recognize our own judgmental attitudes. We need to acknowledge our prejudices and be willing to unlearn some of the habits and comfort levels that we currently have. And that's not easy. So let's talk about safe emotional environments, and creating those begins upon admission. So the first step is to sit down. You know, standing up creates a power differential that interferes with connection and authenticity. So when you're doing your military assessment, ask, have you served in the military? Don't ask, are you a veteran? Now, and I have you ask it this particular way because many veterans don't identify themselves as a veteran. They may define veterans as those who served overseas, or only those who served in combat, or only those on a service-connected disability. So if you'll say it instead, have you served in the military, you're more likely to get an accurate answer. Now, if they have, then ask them if they've ever served in a dangerous duty assignment. Not have you served in combat. The reason I have you ask it in this way is because there are many non-combat assignments that are very dangerous, and the after effects can last a lifetime. Now, if they have been in a dangerous duty, then inquire about any unfinished business. You know, I would often phrase it like this. You probably saw a lot of ugly things during that time. How did that impact you? See, that's what you want to know. Notice that I don't spend time on data like where you served or when you served, those types of things, unless I need context, because I'm not so concerned with what happened, which is what data gives you. I'm concerned about how something happened that might still be affecting that person and might complicate peaceful dying. Remember, the overall context, no matter what, is hospice, is dying healed. Dying healed is the goal. And the reality is you may only have 30 minutes, 60 minutes to try to figure that out. So our job is to create a safe environment where a veteran allows their reports of pain and fear to come forward. And that means learning how to safely penetrate any stoic walls that might be imprisoning them. So you want to start by simply affirming the feeling aspect of their death experience, especially the tears and the fears, which the military culture taught them to disdain. You need to anticipate that they might just underreport their physical and emotional pain, and they might underreport feelings of helplessness and fear of losing control. Remember, fear and pain is viewed as a sign of weakness in the military, and that's a value that may have stuck with them their entire life. Now, I also want to talk about a subset of veterans who need special attention. You know, the population of Vietnam vets needing health care is continuing to rise and will continue to do so over the next decade. So you see this on the chart. So we need to learn how to respond to the unique issues of Vietnam veterans. And the most important thing we can do is to learn how to repair the secondary wounding that they incurred by the general public. I've had more than a few Vietnam vets express something like this to me. I can forgive the North Vietnamese for trying to kill me. They were just doing what they were trained to do. What I can't forgive is the American public. I think you can appreciate that bitterness is a poison for the soul that greatly complicates peaceful dying. Now, secondary wounding in the literature is defined as people's response to trauma with disbelief or denial or minimization or stigmatization or a refusal of help. Not only that, it is especially damaging if it blames the victim. And that's what happened with our Vietnam vets. They were often called murderers, baby killers, spit upon right in the airports as they came home. And this is like pouring salt into the wound. I cannot tell you how many times I would listen to a Vietnam veteran's story, and I would hear the secondary wounding that he or she had endured. And before I would leave that veteran's room, I would reach out to shake that veteran's hand, or I would kneel down before them, and I would say something to the effect of, "I am so sorry for the scorn and indignities that you had to suffer because of our ignorance. Please know that you are a hero and that unsung heroes are the most worthy kind." And what you will see is tears. More importantly, you will see a soldier brought home from war at last. So hopefully your hospice has a program for welcoming home Vietnam vets. And we'll tell you a specific way you might want to consider doing that. The yellow, red, and green colors represent service in Vietnam. So you might see bumper stickers that have these colors, and you'll know that that's a Vietnam veteran driving that car, for example. Now, these are beads that can only be made by a Vietnam veteran and can only be given by one Vietnam veteran to another. So this is a picture of one of our Opus Peace founders, Marie Bainbridge, who happens to be sitting here with me. She is a Vietnam veteran, Bronze Star recipient, and you see her welcoming home another Vietnam veteran. So think about ways that you might incorporate this tradition to help your Vietnam veterans come back home. Maybe you want to do something on March 30th, which is National Welcome Vietnam Veterans Home Day. Certainly, it can be incorporated into bedside ceremonies. And I've got someone on the line, Angie Snyder, and she is going to give you an example of how she did that with a dying Vietnam veteran. Angie?
Thank you, Deborah. So as you all know, with the onset of the pandemic, hospices had to get very creative to be able to honor their veterans. And we also had to learn how to provide care with an all hands on deck mentality. So I worked in an administrative role, but I was asked to see a patient one weekend. So now as an administrator, it was a rarity for me to ever get out to the bedside. But I agreed, and I was sent to see a gentleman who clearly was transitioning and soon would die. So I spent time with his wife during the visit and learned that he was a Vietnam veteran, and he had a lot of resentment toward the VA, towards civilians, and towards others because of the way that he was treated after returning from Vietnam. So the wife went on to say that he never talked about what happened in Vietnam, and she was concerned about his ability to die peacefully. So I immediately knew that I needed to do something for this man. So I went back and I called my other team members. And within 1 hour of time, I had my entire team on board for doing a bedside pinning ceremony and a Vietnam welcome home. Now, this was in the height of the pandemic, so it did require some innovation. So I used Zoom. I was able to set up Zoom so his entire family could join and the entire hospice team could join virtually. And I was able to take one other team member into the home with me, fully dressed in our PPE, as was the family. So I had our music therapist on Zoom to provide patriotic music, and we started the ceremony acknowledging his service. And when we got to the welcome home part of the ceremony, I presented this man with the Vietnam beads that you saw on the previous screen. Now, I'm not a Vietnam veteran, so prior to the ceremony, I received special permission from Opus Peace President Emerita Marie Bainbridge to present the Vietnam beads on her behalf. And what I witnessed after I pinned him was amazing. This frail, weak, emaciated man lifted his back off the bed, and with his eyes full of tears, he muttered, "Thank you." This man was finally welcomed home. I continued with an apology on behalf of the American people for how we treated him and how we treated his comrades when they returned from Vietnam. And this man continued to cry, and you could see how easily he relaxed back into the bed. He died 2 hours after this ceremony, and I contend that he died peacefully.
Let's all just take a moment to anchor our hearts as we hear that story. We think of this man. Just take a deep breath and let yourself be open to bringing these kinds of experiences to other Vietnam vets. Thank you, Angie. Thank you for doing that with this man, and thank you for doing it for his family as well. You gave him a peaceful death. All right, well, let's talk a little bit about families of veterans. I often call families unsung heroes because veterans are often identified as heroes, but family members, not so much. Their contributions often get ignored or minimized. You know, I will never forget a veteran in my audience one time who stood up when I was finished speaking, and this is what he said. He said, "When I came home, my wife gave me love, respect, and comfort. I gave her Vietnam." You know, I could only stand there absorbing the poignancy of the truth in his words. So you can see how PTSD does not exist in a vacuum. It affects whole family systems, whole generations of family systems. So let me give you a bird's eye view of the impact of the aftermath of war on veterans' families. As most of you know, or maybe don't know, Sue Gibson is the wife of a Vietnam veteran. His name is Bruce. And I'm going to show you a 5-minute video that will give you a bird's eye view of how Bruce's military service impacted his wife, Sue.
My husband is a former Marine. When I was 7 years old, Bruce was in the jungles of Vietnam fighting for his life and for his comrade's life. And when I met him 20 years later, he was the embodiment of John Wayne. He was rough, tough, good looking, and always in charge. Yet he was always so very tender with me. The night that Bruce asked me to marry him, he told me this hilarious story about being ambushed in Vietnam. And he was so wounded that they thought he was dead. And with the humor of a stand-up comedian, this man described how they placed him in a body bag. But before they closed it, the corpsman saw him move ever so slightly. And he had me laughing so hard at the way he shared this story. I almost couldn't breathe. And the seriousness and the horror of what this man had just shared with me never registered. And it didn't seem to register with him either. We married 36 years ago, and the first 9 years were just simply amazing. Then the coal mine that he worked at was sold, and the new company came in and severanced out the entire supervisory staff. And suddenly my Bruce was 50 years old, and he had no job. And he became so isolated, angry, irrational, condemning, and unable to hold down a job. And we went from not wanting for anything to not even being able to afford $5 to get my son a haircut. I began to take on more responsibility so that he didn't have to deal with the stress of all this. And he began to move from one job to the next, often just quitting. Finally, he went to the VA, and we were told about post-traumatic stress disorder. What a relief. We had a term for the craziness. But his condition continued to escalate. And then I had this brilliant idea that I could cure him of his PTSD. So I would leave my job as a hospice nurse. And are you ready? I became an over-the-road truck driver with him. You see, my rationale was if I was with him, then I could control all the triggers, and if he wasn't triggered, he could function, and he could continue being the man of the home and take care of the family. Well, that only lasted about 4 months because I was terrified that I was not competent enough to ensure that our children would not end up as orphans. And Bruce couldn't help me. So I returned to nursing, but Bruce continued in this downward spiral. 2 years ago, Bruce attended a fallen comrade ceremony, and he learned about soul injury. And our lives were profoundly changed from that moment forward. He was able to find a measure of peace that now allows him to actively participate in living life. And he will tell you there's no cure. But the emotional gift he received at the Fallen Comrade ceremony has helped him to enjoy his life. And me? Well, I have a new husband. And I'm now discovering how to be a new wife. So I hope that today we can address the soul injury that families often endure, and that our families sustain in the aftermath of war and trauma. I hope that we, as civilians, will learn how to be safe havens for the pain, the shame, and that horrible sense of helplessness that families often carry.
So Sue's president of the Indiana Hospice Veteran Partnership, and she and Bruce have a company called Soul Selah. And you can see their website on your screen, and I'd encourage you to check out services that they can offer you. Also, from hearing that, you can hear the effectiveness of doing ceremonies when they're well constructed, which is what leading up to that I want to be able to describe to you in detail. Now, after having heard everything I've said so far, you might be saying, but I don't want to open up a can of worms and then not be able to get the worms back in the can. And that's a legitimate concern. But keep this in mind. The goal is not to put the worms back in the can. You know, yes, out of the can worms are messy sometimes until they get sorted out. But here's what I would say to you. Open yourself to the veteran. Want to hear them. Be willing to ask the difficult questions that no one else asks. Ask about the worms. When the worms come out, don't be afraid of them. Ask the person to describe the worms. Ask them to feel the worms. Feel the worms with them. Tell them you're sorry that they've had such a wormy experience. Ask them what they want to do with the worms today and how you can be helpful. Tell them you appreciate their honesty in acknowledging their worms, their courage in opening the can, and their humility in asking for help to bring the worms out in the open so they can be used to aerate the soil. And what I have always found is when you can touch your own worms, you can then use your own worms to go fishing, right? So you will find that this strategy will go a long way to help veterans. And also remember that you have a team. Utilize other members of your team, such as your social workers and your chaplains. You don't have to be doing this work by yourself with the cans of worms. That's why we have a team. So now, having told you told you to open the can, I want to tell you right now that you're going to make some mistakes. And if you're sitting there saying to yourself, well, maybe I'll try some of these things once I get them perfect, your practice will never grow. So I encourage you to let yourself be human, make some mistakes, you will. Forgive yourself when you do, and then ask for forgiveness when you do. As long as you are sincere, you will find that veterans are very forgiving. I have found that when I made a mistake and I acknowledge it and I tell them I won't do it again, they not only forgive me, but it actually helps them trust me. And remember, people with PTSD don't trust easily. So when maybe I went too far or I asked the wrong question, I would simply say, I'm so sorry I said that. I can see I went too far. I wasn't respecting what you told me earlier when you said you didn't want to talk about that. Or whatever it might be. Let me give you an example of a mistake I made with a veteran's family that ended up impacting the veteran. So I went to a medical unit to do a consult, and the nurses told me that Emily, the patient's wife, wanted to be present when I saw her husband, Adam. Well, I was also told that she did not want the word hospice used with Adam because she didn't want him to know that he was dying. Now, I deal with these kinds of situations often, and I found that it's usually better for the patient to know, right? It's really ethical that they need to know. So I disregarded Emily's warning, ignoring the difference between usually and always. And I went in and I met with Adam alone. Now, when I was at his bedside, I initiated a discussion about his approaching death. And Adam told me he was relieved to be able to talk about it. We had a great discussion, and I left smugly patting myself on the back for proceeding without Emily's so-called interference. Well, the next day, I came back to visit Adam, and Emily was at his bedside. I introduced myself, and she stiffened up, and she snapped, "Please leave now. And don't talk to me or my husband again." And I can tell you there was no bridging the gap that I had created by disregarding her previous desire to protect her husband. So whatever benefit Adam had gotten from our discussion earlier was undone by the pain I caused his wife. Now, eventually he did come to the hospice and palliative care unit and he died there. And I had to remain outside his circle of care. So I had to go to my team and confess to my team how I had mishandled the situation previously. Well, as I said, a few days later, the patient died, and I thought that'd be the end of it. It wasn't. A few months later, I saw Emily again, this time at our VA hospital's memorial service that we hold for the families of patients who die at our hospital. And she saw me too, and she glared at me from her fourth row seat in the auditorium. And so when I took the microphone to welcome people to the service, I could feel her piercing gaze. And after a few opening remarks, I spoke about how we strive to serve and how we sometimes fail to do that. And then I looked at her directly and I said, Mrs. Schmidt, I know I made a mistake in not listening to your desires for your husband. I realize my action increased the suffering that you were already feeling. I just want you to know I'm very sorry for having done that to you. And she hesitated for a moment, but then she nodded her head and she uncrossed her arms. So I tell you this story because we are not perfect. And if we wait to grow our practice until we can be perfect, then our practice will never grow into those brave spaces that we need to create in order to do the work that we do. So I encourage you to give yourself some permission to make mistakes. I encourage you to recognize them, learn from them, and grow from them. All right, well, now I really want to focus on veterans ceremonies and what you can do to make them effective. So this is a picture of a veteran who died a couple of years ago. He was in hospice care, and the hospice scheduled a pinning ceremony for him. Now, it happened that I knew this veteran very well, so well that you can see me in bed with him. He is my uncle, and he died the day after this photograph was taken. Now, I was quite pleased when the hospice said they were going to do a pinning ceremony to honor his military service. And his children and grandchildren were at the bedside, as well as myself and my brother. Now, here's what their pinning ceremony looked like. 2 hospice staff walked into his room. They introduced themselves, and one spoke to my uncle, but he was only semi-conscious and didn't really respond. The other hospice worker addressed the family to say that they were there to honor his military service. And she pulled out a piece of paper and read a generic expression of gratitude for sacrifice and service. And then they pinned him with a veteran pin. And then they left. Now, my cousins turned to each other and said, that was nice. And then they went on basically as if nothing had happened. And I'm sure that the hospice went back to the office and checked off the box, that a veteran ceremony was provided. But was it as effective as it could have been? What could have made this ceremony a more meaningful interaction that promoted healing? So I'm going to get us started by just saying this. First of all, there's a lot of assumptions. The hospice leaders kept talking about what a hero my uncle was and all the sacrifices he had made. But if they would have checked with my family, they would have found out that my uncle didn't make any significant sacrifice. He had served in the reserves for a short period of time, and he had said it didn't really impact him. Therefore, all the rhetoric about sacrifice and being a hero didn't really resonate for him. It just sounded like generic rhetoric. So there needs to be some flexibility of what is said based on the veteran's experience. And in this case, focusing on being a hero seemed like a sham because it wasn't really the case for him. Now, what could have been done that might have made it more meaningful. We'll replace assumptions with just a few questions. Maybe ask family members for the impact of the military on them, on those family members. You know, if that question would have been asked, the hospice worker would have quickly found out that the military had not really impacted him nor his family. And there would have been a clue in just a few minutes' time. The hospice could have asked if anyone else in the room was a veteran. If they would have discovered that my brother had served 7 years in the military, and it had had a lifelong impact on him. They could have pinned him also, which he would have probably greatly appreciated. And I bet that would have prompted some meaningful discussions with his cousins about his service. What about the generic reading off of a sheet of paper? Was that okay? Well, I'm going to say yes, and a little bit of no also. I'm going to talk about ceremonies in a minute, and it is absolutely fine to have a generic reading of the ceremony, as long as it's done with some style in a dignified manner. You know, pulling a piece of paper out of your briefcase and saying it in a very casual way does not engender that type of feeling. But that same piece of paper in a leather-bound, officially looking folder and delivered in a very deliberate style would have conveyed a very different tone. So take-home points. You have a limited amount of time to plan and implement a ceremony. That is your reality, just like it was for me. So have a well-designed, generic outline based on generalized principles about veterans and their families. And ask just a few well-designed questions to elicit their unique experience. And the easiest way to do that is, instead of asking, again, a bunch of data about where and when, what they did, ask them how their military experience impacted them. Again, maybe ask the family how they think the military impacted the veteran. Maybe ask family members how they, as family members, were impacted by the veteran's military experience. Ask them if there's anything that might still be troubling them now. In other words, looking for that unfinished business. Ask the family, do you think there might be any unfinished business, anything that's still troubling your loved one right now? Because that's really, as a hospice worker, that's what you're wanting to know, is what might be complicating peaceful dying that's coming down the pike. And then later, when you implement your generic ceremony, acknowledge what was said to you when you ask those questions. And what you'll find is that you can, as you gain experience doing this in this way, you'll be able to do it quickly. But more importantly, your ceremonies will be much more effective. All right, so let's talk about how to carefully craft an effective ceremony, whether it be at the bedside, it's an individual ceremony, or a large gathering for a collective ceremony. The anthropology literature tells us how ceremonies, if they're well designed in the 3 stages, provide a map for how to effectively navigate change and provide order in the midst of chaos. So a ceremony will not fix a problem, but it will open us up to a deeper interior dimension that allows us to be at peace with the changes that have occurred or are anticipated to occur. Now, another advantage of ceremonies is that they often take place within a group of people, so that there's some community support that's provided. So let's talk about the 3 stages of a carefully crafted ceremony. The first stage is called the separation stage. And the purpose of the separation stage is to identify a hardship and its burdens. Second stage is the transition stage. And the goal during the transition stage is to change your relationship to the hardship. And then you step into the integration or the incorporation stage. And in this stage, you imagine a different future for yourself. So let's look at these individually, according to the literature. In the separation stage, that first stage, there is a declaration of an intention to change. Now, most of us don't want to be changed because it takes us out of our comfort zone. But what we have to do during this stage is become unattached to what we're familiar with, to what is the same, and open up to something different. And certainly dying, letting go of the whole world as you know and love, and opening up to something very unfamiliar. You can't get any more of a change than that. So when we have to give up what we're used to, what we're familiar with, and open up to what's unfamiliar, we can tend to minimize problems, or we stay in denial so we can maintain the status quo. Now you can see how identifying the hardship requires honesty, to get real without trying to cover up or gloss over or minimize the burden. Getting real means summoning the courage to abide with the feelings that the problem is causing. You know, it takes courage to feel what you feel, especially feelings of hurt and helplessness. Now, the literature says that the separation stage is crucial in creating an effective ceremony. And, you know, in our grief denying, you never have to say goodbye culture, it's tempting to skip the separation stage so that we don't have to focus on the loss and the hurt of letting go. For example, modern funeral ceremonies often try to skip this essential step by starting the ceremony with, "This is not a day to grieve Joe's life. It's a day to celebrate his life." Wow. Unfortunately, this eliminates a safe space to grieve, the very thing that the participants need. Not only that, if the need for change is not openly expressed, then the silence reinforces fear of the problem, and that heightens the control that the problem is exerting. I mean, the whole point of a therapeutic ceremony is to create a safe environment whereby the problem can emerge from hiding so its power can be diminished and the person's empowerment to deal with the problem can be enhanced. So if the ceremony is occurring within a hospice context, then you want to bring the elephant in the middle of the room out into the open. In other words, speak about dying. Now, second stage, a liminal space is the time between the what was and the what's next. Think of it as a threshold where you're not in the room you just came out of, but you have not yet stepped into the room in front of you. Now, anthropologists say that this stage is often the turning point for either acceptance or rejection of the change. So anxiety or resistance can be anticipated to be highest at this second stage because people often feel kind of disoriented. They're being asked to leave behind the familiar and anticipate a new beginning without knowing what that new beginning is going to require. So old identities have to be let go of, while new identities are not yet secured, kind of straddling two worlds, and people don't feel like they yet belong to either one. So the focus during the transition stage is usually on educating people on ways to navigate this desired change and helping them value what it takes to do it. Because again, anthropologists tell us that habits are very hard to break, and yet all transformation takes place in this liminal space. Liminal space is uncomfortable. There's a lot of unknowns. So you can see that this second stage is at high risk for resisting or going back to how it used to be. It's also the key for the change being successful. And I have asked Tracy Rosinski to tell you about how her hospice helps veterans move into this uncomfortable liminal space. Tracy?
Thank you, Deborah. So at the annual Brown County Fair for Veterans Appreciation Day, we provided a resource area for veterans and a recognition ceremony. In addition, we set up a reflections tent. This was an Army tent set up with legit military supplies. There was a cot and a trunk, and the tent was really big, and we provided a couple of chairs and included paper and instructions for folks to write down any thoughts they had while they were reflecting on his or her time in the military. We explained that veterans could take their time in the tent where they would not be disturbed. This was a time for them to release any unmourned loss or hurt or unforgiven guilt or shame that they may still carry from the time that they served. We also gave them Deborah's article on soul injury that was in the Boston Globe. I remember that on that day, the weather was very rainy. What I did not realize at the time, but recognize today, is that people paused to go from the resource area to the reflections tent. It wasn't only the rain that prompted a pause, but what was represented by the tent. It was so powerful.
Thank you, Tracy. You know, Tracy provides a great example of identifying the problem. That's step one. Just by having the tent there, that helps to identify the problem, call attention to it, and also calling it a reflections tent. See, that's that separation stage. And then providing a private place for them to write down the impact that the military had, and also providing an article that helped to educate them on releasing military burdens. Now, some of the literature calls the third stage the integration stage, and others call it the incorporation stage. Either way, the purpose is the same: to instill hope for a future that promises growth so that a new normal emerges. So living your hope requires courage to not fall back into old habits, courage to not fight, flight, or freeze the new changes that are here or are coming. And this stage usually includes a symbol that participants can take home with them. And the chosen symbol should have shared meaning for the individual or within the group. And they are encouraged to let that symbol act as an inspiration to continue on with the change. So therefore, the ceremony can be closed with a sense of renewal and a confidence that change can be navigated. So let's apply this to designing ceremonies that you might want to implement. So again, you're going to start with identifying the hardship or the problem. What is that? It's the answer to that question that hopefully you asked previously, which was, how did the military impact you? Maybe it's, is there anything from the military that might still be troubling you now? If those questions were asked earlier, then that gives you a good idea of what the hardship is for them. And of course, another problem is that the hardship is the hardship that's coming for hospice and palliative care patients, and that is their death. Again, letting go of everything they know and love. And this applies to the family members as well. They have to let go of their loved one. So you don't want to hide this. You want to bring it out in the open. That's the whole point of a ceremony. Now, that second stage, the transition stage, is used to educate participants. Now, this is a picture of our hospice team doing a bedside ceremony, and we're talking to the patient and the family about the value of grieving, forgiving, and letting go of control. You certainly heard that also in Tracy, what Tracy was doing with that tent, the reflections tent. Now, we often use a grounding technique to help veterans learn how to stay in the moment, letting pain and peace sit side by side together without fear. We call that the anchoring heart technique, and we're going to do that in just a few minutes together. So I'll tell you more about that. Now, the integration phase culminates with inspiring hope that the future can be navigated. And how do we do that in hospice? It's telling them how we will be addressing their symptoms talking to them about forgiveness issues, and we'll support forgiveness issues if that's what they desire. And we let them know that we will be following their family after their death for a year, providing bereavement services. Now, again, military service can be honored with a symbol. This is where you would pin the veteran. Again, this is a picture of Marie Bainbridge, one of our Opus Peace founders, doing that with a veteran in a nursing home. Now, you can offer community programs for the public on Memorial Day or 4th of July or Veterans Day or really any other time. And at Opus Peace, we offer what we call a more than thank you ceremony. You know, our veterans need more than a thank you. We have based our ceremony on Native American welcoming homes ceremonies that Native Americans use for their warriors when they would come home. And the idea is to provide safe sanctuary where the losses can be acknowledged, honored, mourned, and redeemed. So if you think about it, these losses might include comrades who died in battle, or it could include loss of physical and mental health, their own or their buddies. It can include loss of the self that they were before the trauma of war. We all know people come back after war changed. They are a different person. And it's being able to grieve the loss of that person they used to be. Maybe the loss is an assault that occurred within their own ranks. Or maybe it's an unfair government administrative action that was taken against them. Now, we have found that participants experience some level of healing, even if they only witness a ceremony without really participating in it. And family members are also encouraged to attend because they are impacted by their loved one's trauma. Plus, they're the ones providing the support on a daily basis. Now, we also invite civilians and citizens to attend so that they can accept their responsibility to help heal our nation after war. No one is immune from the wars that we declare. So we teach citizens how to provide a safe environment so that the wounds that veterans sustain in our name can be healed together. And we've even made these ceremonies available in a digital format that you can use to host as a turnkey operation with minimal effort to operationalize. So, but first, let me just show you a 5-minute news clip that can help you appreciate how such a program can be marketed to the public, offering hope and healing to veterans and their families.
You're watching Fox 13, and the 10 o'clock news starts now.
And it's a time to acknowledge our nation's brave for serving our country and protecting our freedoms.
Oh, yes, and survivors of war can face wounds that you can't see, and they last for decades. An organization is bringing awareness and healing to these soul injuries. Surviving battle comes with its own cost.
Other stuff, nice.
The physical toll of war can last a lifetime.
And just like you, my soul has been injured by military service.
And so can the emotional.
This is an opportunity to heal the wounds that your soul may be still carrying. This is the hard part.
During a ceremony in Tampa, veterans and families of veterans are taking what may be their first step in facing a soul injury.
How do we decide who we would see and who we did not with only 20 beds?
That I've been rehearsing his funeral for 8 years.
Soul injury is any time we get separated from our real self. And often how that occurs is from unmourned loss and unforgiven guilt and shame.
Deborah Grassman is the founder of Opus Peace.
We gather together to experience personal healing.
A nonprofit organization that provides educational programs like this one about soul injury. It was something she discovered while caring for dying veterans as a hospice nurse.
Often what I would see at the end of life is these memories, these guilts that would surface unbidden on their deathbeds.
Grassman wrote about those experiences in her book called Peace at Last.
Decided to dig myself in.
It spoke to Army veteran Buzz, who suffered his own soul injury after coming across the remains of a German soldier during World War II.
His helmet was still on the ground. His rifle was disassembled. Apparently an American soldier, and our troops were in that area prior to that, apparently came upon him and didn't give him a chance to surrender or anything, and he shot him right in the top of the head. That unnerved me, to say the least, and I had a job to do, so I took the helmet home with me. And for about 75 years, I never told a soul.
But that changed after he read Grassman's book.
That's when he felt released, and then he came and gave me the helmet.
I thought, holy cow, I can get rid of this and relieve myself of all the pain I've carried.
Great to see you. Now Buzz is following in Grassman's footsteps, volunteering at a hospice for veterans in hopes of giving them peace in their final days.
My job is to get them to talk, because they want to talk to a veteran.
Soul injury can also apply to the families of veterans.
I know that he experienced some trauma, although he did not speak of it.
What I would say to family members is, let yourself grieve the loss of that person, because you're right. He or she is never going to be the way he or she used to be.
Grassman says it's not just the bravery of veterans that the country needs to recognize, but also their burden.
We wave the flags, do all the patriotic stuff, and that's important. Acknowledge them now, that's important, but it's not enough. What's more than that they need is to acknowledge the losses that they have sustained and to teach them and show them how to grieve, and also to learn how to forgive, especially forgive themselves.
Grassman says soul injury extends beyond veterans. It could also apply to victims of assault or abuse.
So let's talk about thanking veterans, recognizing that they need more than just a thank you. So typically, appreciation is part of a ceremony. But I just want to ask you, have you ever thanked a veteran who didn't want to be thanked? So I don't know about you, but I used to have a prejudice to thank veterans. I had an agenda to thank veterans. So that means I'm at risk for imposing my agenda on the veteran. And because most veterans do want to be thanked, my assumption that all veterans want to be thanked gets reinforced. Now, I've had veterans decline gratitude by saying things like this to me. Don't thank me. The ones you should be thanking aren't here. They're buried in the ground overseas. Or, I didn't do anything. I wasn't on the front lines. I was just a cook in the kitchen. Or, I played a trumpet in the band, something I loved to do. I should be thanking you for paying me to do it. But you know, since I'm there to thank veterans, I used to argue with them. I'd say, but you sacrificed too. But the troops had to eat. Thank goodness you were there to prepare the food for them. No, but. In other words, what I was really saying was, I don't want to hear what you have to say. You know, I'll never forget what one veteran said to me when I thanked him for his service, because his answer totally changed my practice. He said, if you knew what I did, you wouldn't thank me. Now there is a story lurking behind the scene. And indeed, he started crying and an ugly story came out. You see, it's the untold story that often haunts people. And we miss these stories if we don't realize how to create a safe emotional environment for any story to come forth if it's still bothering them. So there is a spectrum of sacrifice. You can't lump all sacrifice into one basket. You know, is getting killed on the battlefield the same sacrifice as playing a trumpet in the band? No. And what these veterans who did not want to be thanked were, what they taught me is that we need to stop putting them all in the same category. You know, there's a famous military saying that goes like this: some gave all, and all gave some. You see, that's what we need to know. So now when a vet declines being thanked because he or she is minimizing their service, I will say, you know, you're right. Some gave all, and all gave some. Tell me about the some that you gave. Let me give you an example of the importance of the spectrum. I was speaking one time at the University of Iowa, and at the end of my presentation, I had all the veterans in the audience stand up so we could acknowledge them with a pin. And I noted that all of them were men. Well, afterward, I was in the back hall signing books, and a woman came up to me, and this is what she said. She said, I want to thank you for what you said about the spectrum of sacrifice. She said, I'm a veteran. I served in the Army for 20 years. Well, I became really confused because I knew she had not stood up earlier. And she saw my confusion and she said, I didn't stand up because I've never considered myself a veteran before, because I never went overseas. My entire 20 years was on stateside. I didn't think I made any sacrifices the way others did. But now I know I may not have given all, but I did give some, and I will accept that pin if you will still give it to me. Oh, goodness. I was humbled. We cried, we hugged. So again, and this story also reminds us that women are veterans also, and we need to be careful about assuming that the woman in your midst is not a veteran. What about gratitude? Gratitude should be the means to elicit the story. Gratitude's not the end, it's not the goal. So if you work for an agency that provides veteran honoring ceremonies on Veterans Day or Memorial Day, or as an individual at bedside when you're admitted to your program, if you are not collecting the untold story, then your program, I believe, is falling short of what it could be. A veteran who does not want to be thanked, I guarantee you, hides an important story. For a Vietnam vet, it might be bitterness about the government betraying them. But again, when I hear that kind of sentiment, I might still thank them, but it's not for their service that they don't want to be thanked for. I thank them for carrying the burden of a government that used them. And I apologize that they had to carry it. So again, invite that untold story. Asking that question, is there anything from your military service that might still be troubling you now? And it's amazing how many times I've asked that question, the veteran tells me something, and afterward, the spouse will say, you know, I've been with him for 50 years. I've never heard that before. You see, guilt and shame often are at the heart of untold stories. And their guilt and shame can haunt people throughout their lives, and they can also complicate peaceful dying. I was in Topeka one time, and an Iraq War veteran said this to me. He said, you know, I did it right 99 times out of 100, but it's that one time that I didn't that still haunts me to this day. See, that's the story that you want. That's the story that needs offloaded. Now, having said that, I want to say, do not push people to tell their stories of trauma. I believe we do damage when we do that. And I also believe we do damage when we don't know how to create a safe emotional environment for that story to come forth if they so choose. That's called abandonment. So let's talk about the barriers for gathering these untold stories. First of all, It's not easy to face guilt and shame, pain and hurt. The problem is that at the end of life, for all of us, the conscious mind gets weaker and the unconscious mind gets stronger, and traumatic memories that have been stored in our body tend to come out anyway, because the conscious mind can't keep it suppressed any longer. Another factor is that family members often don't want to hear about guilt and shame because it can be upsetting. So if you inquire about military service that might still be troubling to them, the spouse might say, "Oh, we don't talk about that." And then you can explain that previously that was important, but that the patient's needs are changing now, and that you found that for many veterans, they do now want to talk about it. Also, vets are protective, and their silence may be because they don't want to distress their family. Another barrier might be that hospice staff don't want or know how to hear about emotional pain. Of course, this is a factor that education and support, like we're doing today, can hopefully help to change. And it's certainly one of the reasons why we hope that people will kind of reconsider what our dying veterans need. We also have a desire to rescue people from hurtful feelings. What we may not realize is that can be counterproductive. So instead, we want to help them feel their feelings. Rescuing is often why we offer platitudes, because our goal is often to make people feel better. In other words, ugly and difficult is not safe with me. Now, a barrier you may not have considered is the public image that most of us hold toward veterans. We have this image of veterans always being strong and courageous and protective. They never make wrong decisions. They're a patriotic hero. They always do the right thing. After all, they're the few, they're the proud, and they are being all they can be. Is this realistic? And how does this compare to the rest of us mere mortals? And what happens when we project this image onto veterans? I will tell you, it hides their untold stories. This is an email I received from a veteran after I had provided this information to an audience. And this is what he said: "Thank you for your sensitivity to veterans who have the perfect image projected onto them by well-meaning people, while they themselves are so terribly conflicted about what they may have done. As a veteran myself, and now as a counselor, I've encountered this several times in the young veterans who are returning from Iraq and Afghanistan." Now, I told you earlier that during the transition stage, education and self-help tools are effective. And research is showing that grounding techniques are the most effective tools for people to use when they've been traumatized. So let me give you an example. I want to share a newspaper article in the Tampa Bay Times that chronicled how a counselor helps veterans with PTSD. The reporter interviewed both the counselor and a traumatized veteran named Lee. And here's what the newspaper article said. "In his mind, Lee Prestonary kept circling the crash site. His friends were in the wreckage below and he could not help. The memory brought him to tears. Seated across from him is a trauma expert who's watching his body language. She coaches him using the tools that he had learned from her, which was to unclench while remembering the pain. It allowed him to accept that there was nothing he could have done." So you can see how learning to unclench can be an antidote for helplessness and distress. Now, at Opus Peace, we combine unclenching with a gesture of anchoring your heart. And let me explain what your body already knows. When you are calm and relaxed, your energy usually resides low and deep down within yourself, and you might report feeling open or grounded or peaceful. But when you're beside yourself, you feel very different, and that's because anxious energy usually climbs up from your belly into your chest, and your voice rises in pitch and breathing becomes shallow. And you might report feeling uptight, flighty, or scattered. But you can access natural body wisdom that you may not even realize you have. For example, have you ever received bad news that caught you off guard? What'd you do? Maybe you gasped and catching your breath. Maybe you grabbed your chest with an open palm to steady yourself. Well, why do you do that? Because unconsciously, you are anchoring yourself so you can stay in your own skin and become grounded again. So the anchoring heart technique simply applies this same gesture, but doing it consciously. You know, it's really an act of self-compassion when you feel anxious or hurt or angry or helpless. So I want to just take 2 minutes for us to do it right now. So if you can, I'm going to ask you to lower your eyes or to close them completely, whatever you prefer, and to place one or both hands firmly and tenderly on your heart, applying enough pressure that you can feel the sensation on your chest from your hands. And now, breathe deeply. Breathe deeply. And just take a moment to get real with yourself, to sincerely feel whatever it is that you may be feeling or trying not to feel. Just noticing what is really in your heart. What's in your heart today? Not in your head, but your heart. Whether it's good, bad, ugly, or beautiful, whatever it might be. Giving permission for your heart to feel whatever it's feeling. And now pause for 5 seconds and just let yourself become still. Let yourself become curious about the place inside you that is strong enough to hold whatever it is you are feeling. This brave place inside you that is not afraid of your emotional pain and is also not afraid of your goodness. Just connecting with your being. And slowly become more aware of the sensations of your body. Slowly opening your eyes if you close them. And as you prepare to move on with your day, bring with you this connection of how to let pain and peace sit side by side together without fear. Good. So you can see how this is about keeping it real with yourself. You don't have to be real with others, but to experience the full force of your own soul, it's keeping it real with yourself, noting your experience. That's what the anchoring heart technique provides. So this is what we just did. Now that you've done it, so that you know exactly what we did, the first step's to anchor with one or both hands firmly and tenderly on your heart. And firmly is the operative word. It's not just putting your hand over your heart like you do for the Pledge of Allegiance. It needs to be firmly enough to create a sensation in your body that registers in the central corridor of your brain. Now, once you've done that, breathe deeply And then the second step is to get real, to feel whatever you're feeling or trying not to feel. Good, bad, ugly, beautiful. Even if it's just for a few seconds, it will still change those neurons in your brain. And the third step is to be curious about the place inside you that's strong enough to hold your pain without fear. And this really is one of the most important steps. You know, the first two steps create a conditioned response in the brain that will help you associate feelings of keeping your heart open when there's a trigger. But the third step engages your being. And it is this third step that connects you to the hero within your heart that's holding your pain for you right now, whether you know it or not, holding it for you unconsciously. This is how you create space for grace. You know, it's not enough to just ventilate feelings. You know, feelings pass, feelings change. It's about befriending the part of yourself that's holding those feelings so that you can be fully conscious, fully awake to yourself. So I do want to tell you about an event that I think you'll want to be a part of. February 2nd, coming up next month, is National Anchor Heart Day. It's a worldwide enactment of this, what's really going on inside me gesture. It's going to be from 3 o'clock to 3:15. There will be a 1-hour webinar that precedes this anchoring heart technique gesture that's going to be done around the globe. So that's going to be from 2 p.m. to 3 p.m. Eastern time. And all of these things that we'll be doing are free. You do need to register. And after registering, you will get an email with a link to the webinar. So as I said, look for the details of that. Make sure and put your email address in the chat box if you want to make sure and get notified of this so that we will have it. But I want you just to imagine citizens around the globe, companies all over the planet pausing for 3 minutes of silence to turn inward, take a deep breath, and open their heart to whatever they're feeling. You know, imagine people discovering that brave place inside them that unconsciously carries their emotional distress for them. Imagine communities having meaningful dialogues about their experience of letting pain and peace sit together. And imagine the possible changes in behavior after February 2nd that could occur with individuals who start realizing that rather than using numbing agents to try to not feel what they're feeling, they could anchor their heart and let themselves get real with what they are feeling. So again, we found that the anchoring heart technique helps to penetrate stoic walls. Veterans are trained to be stoic, and that's important on a battlefield. It's important when you have a mission to get accomplished, but stoic walls can get in the way because they can separate a person from their own sense of self. And that's called a soul injury. You know, a soul injury is a wound to your sense of self, your real self that's beyond the facade. And if a soul injury occurs, you become missing in action. You become missing in your own life. Now, soul injuries are caused by 3 things: unmourned loss and hurt, unforgiven guilt and shame, and fear of helplessness and loss of control. And how did we learn this? Well, you know, when people come to hospice, they start looking back over their lives, and suddenly they know what's important and what's not. You know, the day before their terminal diagnosis, they take their life for granted. The day after, they wake up. They discover that their life matters. And people start realizing just how helpless they are to control what is coming. And that's when humility allows new lessons to emerge. And what we were able to do was to help veterans learn how to move from numbing their pain to mourning their pain. They moved from hiding their guilt to using their guilt to learn how to forgive themselves and others. They moved from being ashamed of not being good enough to releasing their fear of who they were and who they were not. And somewhere along the way, they figured out how to let themselves feel their helplessness over things they had no control over, rather than trying to control things that they could not. And then, you know, some of them would say to me, why did I have to be dying in order to learn how to do this? You see, that's the gift that death is. Death causes facades to crumble and people become real. Now, I don't want to glamorize death or romanticize dying because death is ugly. Death is difficult. But just because something isn't pretty or isn't easy doesn't mean it doesn't have something to teach us. So let's talk about how to create those environments where veterans can touch their pain, their guilt, their shame, and their helplessness. You know, touching the part of yourself holding emotional pain is important because when your pain gets boxed up, your vitality, your personhood, your passion gets boxed up as well. And that's a recipe for losing yourself, which is the definition of a soul injury. So the job at hand is we need to learn how to develop a different relationship with the part of ourself carrying our pain. Because when pain shows up, most of us don't say, "Oh, welcome, I'm so glad to see you." No, what do we say? We say, "Go away, get out of here. I don't like you. I'm afraid of you." And then we numb out that part of ourselves. So instead, we want to say to ourselves, "Tell me how you're hurting. I will listen." That's what that anchoring heart technique does. You know, when we don't grieve, then the part of self that's carrying our pain unconsciously is left homeless, stuck out into unconsciousness, no place to go. So the first step of healing is to stop being afraid of your pain. And clinicians have to stop being afraid of it too, or you'll try to shut down or cheer up your patients when they try to tell you about the losses that they're experiencing as their health is changing. You know, a wise chaplain on our hospice team put it this way: it's unethical to ask our patients to do what we ourselves are unwilling to do. We need to acknowledge the loss, extend compassion to the part of ourself that's been carrying the pain so that it knows it's heard. You know, validating your suffering counters denial. And the acronym for denial is don't even notice that I'm lying. You know, denial is a numbing agent, probably the most common numbing agent. When you are living your life passionately, you stop numbing the pain and instead let yourself feel it. You stop being afraid of your pain. You tell your ego to stop covering your pain up with anger, fear, and shame. You talk to that part of yourself carrying the pain. You comfort that part of yourself, and not numbing agents either. And you tell a trusted other person about your pain. I want to finish up by talking about unforgiven guilt and shame. You know, how is shame different than guilt? Well, shame tells us that we are wrong. We are defective. We are unworthy. We don't matter. Guilt, on the other hand, tells us that something we did was wrong. Those are two very different things. Let's talk about shame. You know, one of the most well-known researchers on the topic of shame is Dr. Brené Brown, and her extensive research on shame has provided this definition: the intensely painful feeling or experience of believing that we are flawed and therefore unworthy of love and belonging. Now, her research showed three things about shame. One, we all have it. It's universal, unless you're a sociopath. We're all afraid to talk about shame. And what's more, the less we talk about shame, the more control it has over us. Now, another interesting study by the National Institute of Mental Health and the National Institute on Drug Abuse found that shame has the same physiological impact as trauma. The brain experiences physical pain and intense experiences of hurt the same way. That fight or flight part of the amygdala. Now, many people think that we should never let shame sit at our table, so to speak. But psychologists would tell us differently. Research has shown us to do it differently. What they tell us now is we need to prepare the table for shame's inclusion. Why? As Dr. Brené Brown said, because we all have a shamer in our head. It's better to bring him or her out in the open. That means that we have to become curious about the part of ourself holding shame. We have to abide shame's presence and change our relationship with the part of ourself that's holding it. Now, Dr. Bessel van der Kolk, one of the leading researchers on trauma, says this about shame. He says that what he says to people is all parts are welcome. We don't say to people, don't be ashamed. We say, let's go there. Let's explore shame. Let's feel shame. Let's see what this shame is all about. Guilt and shame often surfaces at the end of life, and that's because people are getting ready to meet their maker, so to speak. So dealing with guilt and shame can be tricky. First of all, you have to distinguish between guilt and shame. And once you do that, you have to help them discern what to do with it. Again, I'm going to tell you that chaplains and social workers can be valuable resources to help with this. However, the topic often comes up in unguarded moments when chaplains or social workers are not there. So it's important to have at least a basic skill set in responding to these issues when a patient brings it up, because your response will often determine whether they feel safe or unsafe to unlock these stories. So in general, all staff, if they can just recognize that there might be a guilt or shame issue, then they can refer out to another member of the team. I want to give you an example of guilt and shame that I specifically use so that you can kind of see the difference in leading people into that area. I had asked a dying veteran if there was anything still troubling him from the military, and he said no. I then asked him if there was anything, as we kept talking, I said, well, was there anything else, maybe not from the military, but something else that might still be troubling you? And he said, yes. He then told me this. He said, I pissed on the grave of a preacher who molested me when I was a boy. I said nothing for a moment, just kind of absorbing, the violence of what he had endured as a child. And then I said this, good. I'm glad you did that. He looked at me incredulously and he said, you are? I said, yes, he deserved that. He violated you. Pissing on his grave was nothing compared to what he did to you. And I can tell you that veteran immediately looked relieved and he said, oh my gosh, I thought I was going to hell for doing that. So helping him see that he had been a victim, he had been helpless, and that angry feelings are actually appropriate, brought him into the reality of what he had experienced. And that reality brought him relief. Now, let me contrast that with another veteran that I saw. This veteran had been part of a motorcycle gang, and he described himself to me as a bad boy. And he said to me, I watched lots of women get gang raped. Oh, and I was struck by his lack of remorse. In fact, he seemed a little bit proud of it. Again, I said nothing, letting myself absorb the violence of what these women had endured. Then I asked him about the effect this had on the women. He said he didn't know. Well, I've got to tell you, I had to fight to try to remain non-judgmental, and that wasn't really easy for me. But the fact that he told me what he had done suggested he might be ready to start taking some responsibility for it. He couldn't really feel the pain of what he had done, but if I stayed open and connected to him, maybe I could feel his pain for him so he could feel it for himself. So with emotion, I said to him, my hope for you is that you reflect on what you did to the women you watched get raped so that you can understand the pain that you caused by witnessing their harm without stopping it. My hope is you will let yourself feel the pain of those women, not for their sakes, but for your own, so that you can sincerely feel remorse and ask for forgiveness. So again, those are the kinds of issues. So be careful about just trying to dismiss guilt and telling people, oh, you were doing the best you could with what you knew at the time. I'm not saying that that's not true, but that's not going to help uncover what might be troubling a veteran. So I think I am at my stopping point. I had a little bit more to tell you, but I think I'm going to stop right there. So Catherine, any questions that you want to relay to me?
Oh boy, I know there's plenty still more to go over. One that did come in from the chat box was, as our Veterans Outreach Coordinator and a Marine Corps veteran, with time I get to know our hospice veterans and families who open up as a fellow veteran. I take on their stories, pain and fears, an honorable duty, and one that is semper fidelis, helping with their end-of-life healing and peace. I can learn whether they want a ceremony or not, and sometimes just sharing their story is all they want. What do you recommend for us who hold these stories in our hearts now? How have you cared for your heart?
Well, I love what she's saying. First of all, about the veterans themselves, that just sharing the story is the valuable piece. And I love what she's asking, she or he, I don't know who's asking it, is saying too, recognizing that we take these stories on, we vicariously experience those stories. So what do we do with them? The first thing I would say is anchor your heart and let yourself feel the pain of whatever that veteran dumped on you in a way. I mean, that's really kind of, you know, the rule is we create that safe environment, we feel their emotional pain with them. And so now it's with you, letting yourself feel it instead of numbing it out and detaching from it. That's a sure way to create burnout. People always say when they hear you work in hospice, I know with me, they'd always say, oh, you work in hospice? I could never do that. Oh, you have to, you know, that's, yes, we're inundated with emotional pain. It's all around us, every door that we walk into, every situation we walk into, but it's not feeling it. It's numbing it out, covering it up that will lead to burnout. So part of releasing it is really consciously, not unconsciously, but consciously taking a moment before we go to see. What I would always do, because I worked in a hospital, so I was going from one patient's room to another, to another, to another, to the ICU, to the ER, wherever it was. But I would always pause, take that moment to breathe in what I had just taken in, let myself feel the hurt of it, feel the anger of it, feel the whatever it is of it, and then bring fresh into that next moment. The second thing I would say is, I do believe if you work for a hospice agency, a palliative care agency, where they know, you know, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross said that every attached to every hospital unit should be a scream room for the staff. So again, I think if you're a hospice or a palliative care agency, if you're an administrator, you have to have programs for your staff. So we used to have programs for our, you know, what I used to do every month, once a month for all the staff. We did a bereavement program, half an hour for the staff, where they could bring forth what was still lingering in their heart. We would do a collective anchoring of the heart and let that hurt come forth. And then we would have different ways to, like I told you, with the ceremonies of releasing that with a symbol that they could leave with, those types of things. So again, it's about feeling your pain. It's real and you want it to be conscious. You don't want it to be unconscious. So it's amazing. The very thing that we often are running away from is the very thing that'll free us up. You're on mute, Catherine.
There it goes. Okay, thank you for that. I did wanted to pose one more question. Do you have any recommendations for educating younger staff about what Vietnam veterans experienced when they came home? I'm in my 20s and I have a grandfather who served in Vietnam, but when I started in hospice, I didn't really understand the concept of saying welcome home to Vietnam veterans. I think a lot of millennials aren't aware of the scorn these veterans left from public upon returning home.
Well, I would answer that. So I appreciate that she had the courage to ask it number one, and the vulnerability to acknowledge that she didn't know, even in her own family with her grandfather. So what I would say is, she's asking essentially, how do I learn about what happened? My first answer to that is ask them. Start with your grandpa and say, and just say, I don't know what happened over there, but I'm hearing different things. Tell me what happened with you. How did Vietnam impact, that word impact, how did it impact you? Now, recognize, however, that when you're doing that with a grandpa, for example, and he's got his little granddaughter or grandson there, he's going to want to protect him or her, so he may not truly come forth with it. But at least there's an opening. So I would start there. I mean, obviously, I have a big prejudice toward my book, Peace at Last. That is kind of the sentinel book that opened the door for all of hospice and palliative care. NHPCO recognized, they came to me and said, oh my gosh, you've opened the door to this whole thing we didn't even know was out there. We had no idea how veterans experience death differently than non-veterans. So obviously that's a resource that I would encourage her to start with as well. And so at any rate, that's the first couple of things. And I think it always just helps, just the fact that she or he is opening up and being curious about, oh my gosh, there's something here I don't know. You'll be surprised how cues will start coming into her or him automatically. It will come once you want to learn, the universe responds. Grace abounds.
Great point. Okay, I know we're over time. Just a couple of few things. I know folks had a few questions about examples regarding Welcome Home Vietnam Veterans Day ceremonies, as well as pinning ceremonies. Please know there are a ton of resources, not only on the We Honor Veterans page, but also on Opus Peace. We also have a Opus Peace dedicated resource page on our website, so please feel free to poke around there. There's a wealth of information. If you need any more, please reach out to us. One last housekeeping thing. I know a lot of folks are submitting their emails through the chat box for CEs. Unfortunately, we will be going off of the Zoom registration and attendance link. So as long as you're on there, you are good. We also have folks asking about upcoming events. Know that by participating in this, don't worry, you will be hearing both from We Honor Veterans and Opus Peace about upcoming training opportunities, webinars. We will keep you posted on anything and everything, so please do not worry. And again, this webinar was recorded. We will be posting it. However, we will not be posting the slides, but the recording will be up in just a few days. And don't forget to register for the Anchoring Heart event on February 2nd and for the next We Honor Veterans webinar on February 8th. So with that, I did want to just extend a wealth of gratitude for Deborah Grassman and the team at Opus Peace for joining us and just sharing the wealth, the wisdom, all of this information that is needed probably now more than ever. We continue to appreciate. And again, do not hesitate to reach out if you have questions, feedback, comments, anything at all. We love to hear it. Anything else, Deborah, before we sign off?
I don't think so. The only other thing I will say is we do also, WestCare is providing certifications for counselors. So in addition, so there's CEs that Opus Peace is providing to the nursing and social workers, and WestCare is providing certifications for the different counselors. I think that was on the advertisement, so you can see with that, but you're still going to be dealing with Angie for those as well.
All right, thank you. Well, thank you everyone for joining us, and wishing you a wonderful rest of your afternoon, evening, and week ahead. What a great start to the new year, and we're looking forward to more throughout 2023. Thank you, everyone.
Yes.